Okay, everyone. So good morning, good afternoon, and maybe good evening to everyone for this quick Q&A session. It's good to have Ashwanee, who's based at the University of Pretoria, but is from Mauritius. Is that right? She can tell you a little bit more about where she's from, but she runs the equivalent program to ours in terms of the APA program out of for Africa, out of the University of Pretoria. That program's been running a long time, for like 20 years. I think this is the 21st year. But let's come back to the main issue that we're looking at. And so we're going to be looking at issues around human rights in Africa, and also with a focus on public international law. I'm just going to start with a couple of questions to Ashwanee. The first one is just about the general status of human rights in Africa. And is it possible to kind of talk about human rights in Africa, given its size and its diversity? And we had the same problem in Asia. People kind of talk about what's human rights like in Asia, but it's so varied. But how do you address that? Are there any commonalities? How can you describe the status of human rights in Asia? I'll give that over to you, Ashwanee.
Hi everyone, good day. As Mike said, my name is Ashwanee. I'm based in South Africa and I work with the Human Rights and Democratization in Africa program. So to answer your question, Mike, let me just start generally with how human rights is dealt with on the African continent. I know it's the beginning stages of your course, and please stop me if you don't understand something or if I use words that you feel needs clarification. So unlike Asia Pacific, we have a continental organization called the African Union. It was called the Organization of African Unity, and it was founded in 1963 initially, but it transformed into the African Union in 2001, if I'm not mistaken. So the African Union has several objectives, and one of them is promotion and protection of human rights in Africa. So even before the creation of the African Union, the Organization of African Unity in 1981 adopted the African Charter on Human and People's Rights. So it was a turning point for human rights protection in Africa, because this kind of set the tone for human rights protection in Africa. It clearly stated that the Organization of African Unity has as mandate human rights. And it's very different from instruments that you find at the United Nations level. For instance, at the United Nations level, you have the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights and the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights. One deals with civil and political rights, and the other deals with economic, social, and cultural rights. But the African Charter merged the two. So it had civil and political rights and economic, social, and cultural rights in the same document. And that kind of created the whole notion of, or it did away with the notion that economic, social, and cultural rights needed resources. So it was like both should be weighed on the same scale. In addition to adding economic, social, and cultural rights in the African Charter, there's also people's rights. So it talks about rights to self-determination and things like that. So this is very particular to the African context. You have a document that talks about economic, social, and cultural rights, civil and political rights, and people's rights. So it merged the three generations of rights in one document. Now, following the adoption of the African Charter, there were several other documents that have been adopted by the African Union. So, and that dealt with different vulnerabilities that people face. Some of them related to human rights are the African Charter on the Rights and Welfare of the Child. We have the protocol to the African Charter on Women's Rights. We call it also the Maputo Protocol. There are charters on disabilities, which have not yet entered into force because it doesn't have the minimum ratifications. There's also a protocol on elderly persons, which is also not yet into force. And then we have an OAU Refugee Convention, amongst others. So to come to your question, Mike, about whether we can generalize human rights in Africa, that has been a bit problematic because all the countries in Africa are different. And it's not even all the countries, but if you take one country, let me take the example of Cameroon, for instance. You have English-speaking part of Cameroon and you have French-speaking part of Cameroon, and they both have different ways of doing things. They have different practices. The same is the case for South Africa. Like you have the different tribal groups or the different ethnic groups for whom human rights are very different compared to like your white South Africans who have a very Western notion of what human rights are. But I feel like the African Charter and the other protocols or charters adopted after the African Charter tried to take into account the diversity of the continent. So if you look at the African Charter in its preamble, it talks about the preservation of African values. So it doesn't just translate whatever is there at the international level and impose it on the African continent. It kind of molds it to the African context, if I can call it an African context. But then, sorry about that. But then if you look at the African Children's Charter, for instance, it talks about, it proclaims its supremacy over customary practices that are harmful to children. So the documents at the African level recognize that there are customs, and they do provide for the preservation of custom and tradition, but they also provide for the eradication of harmful practices and tradition. So they will protect your custom and tradition to the extent that they are not impeding upon your rights. For instance, the Protocol on the Rights of Women clearly bans female genital mutilation. I'm sure you have female genital mutilation in India and other places also. So here we have the African Children's Charter, the Protocol on the Rights of Women in Africa, which clearly bans this practice and connotes it to a harmful practice that affects children's rights. So this was kind of, while the charter was being drafted, if you look at the travaux préparatoires, this was contended a little bit, and it was a bit of a debate, because then female genital mutilation formed part of the culture of many ethnic groups here in Africa. But then the argument being provided for the inclusion of female genital mutilation in these documents is that it is a practice that is discriminatory towards the girl child, and it affects the girl child's rights in many ways. You also have issues such as child marriage, which, like both the African Children's Charter and the Maputo Protocol, prohibit. And this is also despite the fact that you have a lot of groups here, especially like Muslim groups or like ethnic groups practicing child marriage because of various reasons. Sometimes it's tradition, sometimes people are in conflict countries, sometimes poverty. So there are various reasons for people practicing child marriage, but the charters, like the treaties at the African Union level came to say that we are not accepting child marriage, and it is, like, states should criminalize child marriage. There are also like one very particular provision at the African Union level, which has been very contentious, is that it provides for the right to abortion. So Africa is a very traditional and religious and conservative society. And for that article to find its place in a treaty, it can be considered as very like revolutionary. So, but it is to be noted that that article does not provide for abortion in all circumstances. It provides for abortion in certain circumstances, when the life of the mother or the child is in danger, and for cases like that, for medical reasons or for rape cases. So these, while providing for rights, the different treaties at the African Union level had clawback clauses to make sure that they bear into mind the social realities within which the treaties will operate. But also, many countries which have ratified many of these treaties have placed reservations on some of the articles that they feel like does not adapt to their current context. For instance, Egypt had a reservation on Article 2 of the African Children's Charter, which talks about definition of a child. So if you look at the Convention on the Rights of the Child, it provides that a child is anyone under the age of 18, provided majority is not attained earlier or something like that. But if you look at the African Children's Charter, it's different. It does not provide for this limitation. It says anyone below the age of 18 is a child. So even if you get married before the age of 18, or even if you attain majority in other ways before the age of 18, you will still be considered as a child as per the African Children's Charter. So Egypt had a reservation to that particular article, and there were debates going on about whether it does not defeat the purpose of the treaty. As you know, because of the Vienna Convention on the Law of Treaties, you cannot place a reservation to a particular provision of a treaty that defeats the purpose of a treaty. But then they still let it go. And we haven't, like till now, Egypt still has that reservation and they have not taken it away. I think that's about, oh no, maybe let me talk about the human rights institutions at the African Union level a little bit. So when creating these treaties at the African Union level, we created oversight mechanisms. Sorry. So the African Charter on Human and People's Rights created the African Commission on Human and People's Rights, which oversees the implementation of the African Charter and its protocols. So like for instance, the African Women's Rights Protocol that was adopted under the Charter is also subjected to the African Commission. There has also been an African Court on Human and People's Rights. So it was set up by a protocol to the African Charter and an African Court on Human and People's Rights to again oversee the human rights treaties at the African Union level and also any other treaties ratified by the country. So it has jurisdiction not only over African Union treaties, but also, for instance, UN treaties such as the Convention on the Rights of the Child, the CEDAW, ICCPR, or any other document that has been ratified by the country. Since its inception, the African Commission has received a lot of communications, which are cases. They have adopted general comments to guide states in the implementation of their obligations. They have conducted studies. They have adopted resolutions. They have been very active in advancing the human rights agenda in Africa. The African Court, on the other hand, has been a bit slow, yet progressive in ensuring that human rights are protected on the African continent. The reason is that the African Court Protocol has, under its Article 34.6, provides that when a state is ratifying the African Court Protocol, it needs to make a declaration under Article 34.6 so that NGOs and individuals can have access to it. So if a state has not made that declaration, individuals and NGOs will not have access to the African Court, and it's only states that can bring a case against that state. And we have a brotherhood system going on in Africa. It's very difficult to find a state bringing a case against another state. Till now, only 10 states have made a declaration under Article 34.6 of the Court's Protocol. And some of them who had made a declaration are actually withdrawing the declaration. We had Rwanda, who withdrew its declaration last year, and even Tanzania, who withdrew its declaration. So this shows that states, whenever they are being in the spotlight because of not responding, because of not implementing their obligations, prefer to not be subject to the African Court and withdraw the declaration. The African Court has made very groundbreaking judgments concerning civil and political rights and the rights of women in Africa. And if given an opportunity, it does have a lot of potential. And then the African Children's Charter went a different route. It created its own supervisory body. So we have an African Committee of Experts on the Rights and Welfare of the Child that oversees the implementation of the African Children's Charter. And that particular committee also has made great strides in ensuring the protection of the rights of the child. It has given a lot of decisions against states concerning, for instance, child begging in Senegal. We have child soldiers in Uganda. It has it has adopted general comments to guide states on different issues. And one of them is General Comment 5, which was adopted in 2018, that talks about states' obligations. If you look at the charter, the African Children's Charter, it just states that states have to adopt legislative and other measures. And the African Children's Committee now dwells into what other measures are that states should adopt. And it has a variety of other measures. We have data collection, budgeting, policy making, amongst others. So that's about it for the African Union Human Rights Mechanism. So you have the African Commission on Human and People's Rights, you have the African Committee of Experts on the Rights and Welfare of the Child, and we have the African Court on Human and People's Rights. I see we have questions.
Yeah, but just before we get to the questions, I'll come to them next. Just because we also want to cover some of the issues around public international law. So how does it work, this kind of comparison of like having an African Charter on Children and the CRC? There's things like ratification and reservations and the obligations of states. Are they pretty much the same? And with these kind of international laws like CEDAW and CRC, is there a high ratification rate in Africa?
So the CEDAW has more ratifications than the Protocol on the Rights of Women in Africa. The Protocol on the Rights of Women in Africa has been ratified by 42 out of 55 African states. So let me just clarify something here. If you look at the UN, Africa has 54 states. But at the African Union level, we have 55 states. This is because the African Union recognizes the Western Sahrawi Republic as an independent state and not part of Morocco, what the United Nations does. So now coming to the ratification trends in between the UN instruments and the African Union instruments. So the Protocol on the Rights of Women in Africa, for instance, has been ratified by only 42 out of 55 African states, whereas the CEDAW has been ratified, if I'm not mistaken, by all African states except for Morocco and Egypt, or Morocco, I'm not sure about that. But there's only 2 states which have not ratified the CEDAW. So there's more ratification of the UN document than the AU document. The same is the case for the African Children's Charter. It has less ratification than the Convention on the Rights of the Child at the UN level. The reason being that we recently did a study that did a comparison between the Convention on the Rights of the Child at the UN level and the African Children's Charter, and try and understand the reasons why the CRC is ratified more universally in the African continent than the African Children's Charter. And we found that the African Children's Charter imposes higher levels of obligations on the state than the Convention on the Rights of the Child. Sorry. Remember, the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child is very broad because it had to make sure that it incorporates the concerns of all the countries in the world. Whereas the African Children's Charter is more specific to the African continent. For instance, the African Children's Charter, like I stated before, pronounces its supremacy over harmful traditional and customary practices, whereas the CRC does not do that. It does so through general comments. We have General Recommendation 31 of the CEDAW committee that was adopted jointly. But then hard law, like legally, in the document, it does not pronounce itself on customary practices. So this then on its side, if you look at it, African states have a higher have heavy obligations under the African Children's Charter. Secondly, if you look at the best interests of the child principle, the UN CRC talks about the best interest of the child is one of the consideration in a case concerning children's rights. Whereas in the African Children's Charter, the best interest of the child principle is the primary consideration. So again, states have to pay more attention to best interest of the child principle when dealing with cases of children's rights. And you have issues like, for instance, child marriage, which is prohibited at the African Union level, but it's not at the CEDAW level or at the CRC level. So African states usually, although they are the ones who providing inputs for the drafting of the regional instruments, do not really are very reluctant to adopt or are very reluctant to ratify treaties at the African Union level because of them having higher obligations. But then also, if you look, like I come from Mauritius, and we ratified the Maputo Protocol recently in 2017, and we had to report. So when you ratify a treaty, you have to report on how you're implementing the obligations under that treaty. And in the African human rights system, it's after every 2 years. So we had to report on how we are implementing the provisions of the Maputo Protocol. And although we did report on the African Charter, we did not really report on the Maputo Protocol. So the African Commission has adopted guidelines on state reporting under the Maputo Protocol, because states would not report on how they're implementing the obligations on the Maputo Protocol. They would just talk about the African Charter because that has universal ratification. And they won't talk about the Maputo Protocol. They prefer focusing on the CEDAW report than on the Maputo Protocol. So like if you look at this report that they produced to the CEDAW, it's very comprehensive and it includes all aspects of women's rights, whereas the report produced to the African Commission, whereas in the report produced to the African Commission, it really talks about, it has very limited provisions on women's rights. So there was, we wrote a paper recently with a colleague, and we were trying to assess why Mauritius focuses more on the UN system concerning women's rights rather than the African human rights system. And the conclusion we drew is that one of the reasons might be because there is an independent human rights monitoring body at the UN level that focuses on children, on women's rights, whereas we do not have that at the African Union level. So at the African Union level, you have the African Commission that deals with all the rights in the African Children's Charter and women's rights. So that might be one of the reasons. But yeah, I think one of the reasons that African states do not ratify African human rights instruments is because it imposes higher obligations on states, which states are not like they don't want to have.
Great, thanks for that. Well, I'll get Gracie to ask the next question. So she's written in the text, but in the chat. But also, Gracie, if you could just give you a question, and also maybe explain to some of the others what proportionality means.
So Gracie has to do that, or I'm doing that?
I was hoping to get Gracie to, because if we're recording, it doesn't record
Hello?
the chat.
Hello?
Are you there? Yeah, Gracie, go ahead.
Yes. Can you hear me clearly? Sorry.
Yeah, we can hear you fine.
Yes. All right. So, Dr. Ashwanee, I'm just wondering, what is your view on the using the concept or the doctrine of proportionality in resolving cases in courts, because there are criticisms that on the usage of this doctrine in resolving courts in South Africa as a direct result to our to human rights. Sorry. Hello.
Okay, Ashwanee.
Yes. If I understand your question correctly, you want me to talk about how, if we apply the doctrine of proportionality, it limits human rights in a way, right?
Yes. Thank you. So, yeah.
Yes. So if you look at the African human rights system, like I'm not going like in different African countries, but if you look at the African human rights system, if you look at the African Charter, for instance, let's take freedom of expression, okay? So the African Charter provides for freedom of expression, but then it has a clawback clause where it states that it can be limited in certain circumstances. And one of them is that it has to be proportional, right? To like the limitation must be proportional, or it must be legitimate. So now we have had cases at the African Union level. I can't remember the name of the case at the moment, but where the freedom of expression, it was Article 19 versus Eritrea, okay? Where freedom of expressions of citizens were being limited without any regard of the legitimacy or proportionality of the limitation. So then the African Commission came in and stated that this limitation is not proportional or legitimate. it does infringe on freedom of expression. So I think in terms of human rights, it depends on the court interpreting it and whether it kind of limits your rights completely. Obviously, not all rights are absolute. Rights are limited, and rightly so. Like, for instance, in the case of freedom of expression, I can't have all the rights I want to, for instance, libel someone or slander someone. But if you take the case of South Africa, for instance, they've been very open with the freedom of expression laws compared to Mauritius, for instance. Like, at the moment, we are, so anyone saying anything against the Prime Minister of Mauritius at the moment, you have a case of libeling or slander against you. So then it's not proportional, because the government is using freedom of expression and limitations to freedom of expression to impede your impede on your right to freedom of expression. So it really is something that has to be decided on a context by context basis, but also it has to be exercised in such a way that it does not impede on the right. I hope that answers your question.
Yes, thank you.
Okay.
Okay, now I've got another question, but this was just sent to me, and this is from Elizabeth in Timor-Leste. But she's asking about how can children get married underage? You know, why is there no regulation for child marriages, and why is there that failure that you still have child marriages if there is clear law in that case?
So Elizabeth, I used to work on child marriage a lot a few years ago, and we worked on a general comment on child marriage and a continental study on child marriage. And we saw that there are several reasons for children getting married under the age of 18. And one of them is that there's no proper birth registration in many places across Africa. So this is something that contributes to child marriage. So even if you have laws, for instance, that prohibits child marriage, if you have not registered the birth of the child, you don't know the proper age of the child. Secondly is laws in the countries. So many African countries, even if they have ratified the Maputo Protocol and the African Children's Charter, still provide for marriage some even provide for marriage as from the age of 14. So you have countries that still do not have laws that criminalize child marriage. So that's the second challenge in regulating child marriage, like domestic laws not criminalizing child marriage. Third, you have poverty. So in a lot of rural areas here, so there's this concept of lobola in many African ethnic groups, where the man has to pick cows before they get married to someone. And that depends. Sometimes you get 2 cows, sometimes you get 40 cows. It depends on your level of education. So sometimes poverty, like it's the contrary of what happens in India, where the woman pays the dowry. Here it's like men who pays for the women. So poor family will sell their child for like 1 or 2 cows, sometimes even for like $2, so that they can have like a week's worth of food. And then fourth, we have like conflicts. There are many countries that are in conflict in the African continent. And to ensure that the child does not fall prone to conflict-related violence, such as rape, or like they don't fall into prostitution, the family prefers having the child married earlier. And then there's also pregnancy. So many societies are still very conventional in Africa. And once you fall pregnant, you get married, whether you agree or not. So these are some of the reasons why it is difficult to regulate child marriage in African countries.
Great. So we'll go to Zoe next, which is about female genital mutilation and religion. Zoe?
Hello. I would like to know about the female circumcisions and the early childhood marriage. And I think it has something to do with the religious interpretations and teachings, especially the conservative one. So what is your opinion on it? And if there are some other religious impacts on human rights violations, please share us. Thank you.
So I I would beg to differ on the fact that it is only religion that has an impact on issues such as female circumcision and in child marriage, because, like I said, there are several factors that impact on child marriage in Africa. But obviously, like in northern African countries, especially where you have a lot of people practicing Sharia law, you have I read something about Morocco, Egypt, Mauritania, Mali. These countries, you have child marriage and female circumcision predominantly because of religion. Okay, so the African court gave a decision in 2018. It was the case of APDF versus Mali and IHRDA versus Mali. So Mali was adopting a new family code. And in that family code, it still allowed for child marriage and for other discriminatory practices in terms of inheritance and female genital mutilation. So the court came to the decision that the family court contravenes Mali's international original obligations to protect the right of the child, despite the fact that their religious practices allow for it. So this case showed that the African court does not hesitate to pronounce itself against religious practices that are discriminatory towards the girl child. So this is now the African court that has taken this decision. And I'm now looking if there are other religious impacts of human rights violations. So at the African continent level, I'm thinking of, if you look at, there was a case at the African committee level, the African Children's Committee, concerning Senegalese talibés. So here, children, like boys under the age, it was mainly boys under the age of 18 were sent from their village to the city in Dakar to work to be in daras, which is like basically educational institutions where they're supposed to learn the Quran, okay? But instead of teaching them the Quran, the marabout, like their teachers, would send them to beg on the streets in Senegal. And they were living in very poor conditions. And one of the daras actually caught fire and the Talibans died. So this is another human rights violations that was prompted by religion, because the children were supposed to go there to learn the Quran. But instead of learning the Quran, the marabouts were making them beg and bring money for them to live comfortably. So that's another religious impact I'm thinking of in terms of human rights violations.
Okay, great. So next we have Renata. You've got a question.
Yeah. Okay. Hi, Ashwani. Thank you for sharing. I'm Renata from Indonesia. So my question is actually, before you said that many of our African countries that are reluctant to adopt the African Charter rights because of the high obligation, the high standard of to achieve. So the thing is, so my question, the first question is like, what is the basis of the African Union form? Like why they form the African Unions? And then if they're reluctant to adopt it. And the second one is, what is the challenges in the implementation? I mean, like, do you have, in Africa, there is any countries can be champions that you can share? Thank you.
Thank you, Renata. So the Organization of African Unity in 1963 was basically formed as a continental body to facilitate trade and other things. So it was not at the basis a human rights institution. And even now, the African Union has other mandates, but Article 4.1 of the Constitutive Act of the African Union gives it a human rights mandate. But I guess you wanted to know the basis of the African Charter on Human and People's Rights, if I understand correctly. So the African Charter on Human and People's Rights, discussions for that started like since the creation of the Organization of African Unity because of the several human rights violations that were happening on the continent at that time. It took a long time to materialize. So the first draft was in Ethiopia, if I'm not mistaken, but then it was not adopted at that time because the leaders at that time were not, they were not sure about whether they want to impose human rights obligations on different African countries. Then eventually, in the Gambia, in the Banjul, they came up with a draft that most African countries agreed on, and they did agree to give in to the supremacy of a regional human rights, of a regional body that will also have human rights connotations. And it was finally adopted in Ethiopia in 1981, but then, and it was one of the documents that has universal ratification at the African Union level, because because simply, like I said, it's very different from the CEDAW and the ICCPR and the ICCO. But at the same time, it doesn't, like if you look at the African Charter on Human and People's Rights, it talks about preservation of customs. It talks about preservation of traditions, which might be a motivation for African countries to actually ratify it. But then again, it's not as harsh as the African Children's Charter and the Maputo Protocol, which does not have universal ratification, because all the rights are very general in a way, and they have limitations. So it was easier for countries to adopt, to ratify the African Charter on Human and People's Rights, because the standard of obligation, how do I say it? Okay, it was easier for them to adopt the African Charter because it did not impose strict or harsh obligations on them in such a way that they did not have to deviate from the way they were doing things already. But also, one of the criticism of ratification of the African Children's Charter is that many states just ratify it so that they show they are doing things for human rights, but then they don't really implement it. If you look at the status of human rights in Africa in terms of freedom of expression, in terms of economic, social, and cultural rights, very like if people are living in poverty, people don't have housing, and that yet you have like the African Charter providing for such rights. So some of them, they might actually just be ratifying for the sake of ratifying, and not really implementing the obligations. And this is happening like in many countries. And if you're talking about countries where I can point out in Africa that are championing implementation of human rights, I can't pinpoint one particular country that has applied all the aspects of the African Charter. For instance, if you look at the Northern African countries, they are doing very well when it comes to economic, social, and cultural rights. But then if you look at civil and political rights, they're not doing so well. If you look at South Africa, for instance, we are not doing good in terms of economic, social, and cultural rights, but we are doing good in terms of, for instance, the freedom of expression. So each country, I would say, has adopted some aspects of the African Charter, and there's still a long way to go for us to find like the country with the best practice. But if you talk in terms of, for instance, female genital mutilation now, you have countries like the Gambia that have criminalized female genital mutilation. You have many countries across Africa that have now criminalized child marriage. So there are baby steps, and it's gonna take a long time for us to find like the country with the best practice, like the country which has implemented all parts of the African Charter. But I think it's a starting point because it gives states, it gives us a yardstick against which to assess states. And the African Commission also helps a lot in the implementation of the African Charter and the Maputo Protocol. So I think it was something that was needed at the African continent level, and it did progress. It did contribute to the progress till now in human rights protection on the continent, but there's still a long way to go. For instance, like many African countries now don't want the International Criminal Court to have jurisdiction over them because they say that they have an agenda to prosecute only African leaders. And they only want the African court to have jurisdiction over Africa. But then again, with the African court, like I stated before, you need to make a declaration under Article 34.6. And many of, like, only 10 of them have made this declaration. So they are also like, they don't want to be subjected to the jurisdiction of a higher court to tell them they're doing this wrong. And like I said before, there's a strong sense of brotherhood in Africa. I'm not even saying sisterhood, because like we have very few like female leaders in Africa. There's a very strong sense. If you look at what was happening in Zimbabwe for so long, you had Mugabe, who was the chair of the African Union. You had Egypt, who was the chair of the African Union last year, despite the several human rights violations that were happening in those countries. So the thing is, if they're meeting at the council level, they won't talk about the bad things against each other. They will actually like praise the other in terms of like the one small step they've made in ensuring that human rights is protected. Yeah.
Yeah, and so much of that also rings true for Asia, Southeast and South Asia as well. I'm sure a lot of the students can relate to those comments. But great, next we've got Razi. So you can just give a sentence introduction to yourself and then your question, Razi.
Thank you very much. You all can hear me because my Wi-Fi connection is dropping today.
Yeah, we can hear you.
Can you all hear me, right?
Yeah, we can hear. Go ahead.
Yeah, thank you very much. That's good. Thank you very much for the enlightening speech and for the presentation. My question is really twofold. So I'm going to ask the first question. That is about the slavery, especially in Mauritania. To my knowledge, I think Mauritania is the only one country which is practicing this slavery. And what are the steps being taken to abolish slavery in Mauritania?
So legally, slavery was abolished in Mauritania a long time ago. But as you said, slavery is still being practiced on a large scale in Mauritania. Recently, I think it was in 2018, the African Children's Committee gave a decision against Mauritania in the case of Said, I think, concerning slavery. So in this case, former masters of slaves were persecuted and in Mauritania, and they were given very lenient sentences. So the African Children's Committee reviewed that sentence and said that the country is not doing enough to ensure that those who are practicing slavery get harsh sentences. So I think at the country level, not much is being done, in the sense that if someone is caught, for instance, practicing slavery, they get very little sentencing. But then the case that was brought to the African Committee shows that if the African Committee gets the opportunity to rule on such cases, they will actually state that the country is not doing enough. That was the first leg of your question. What was the second leg? Sorry.
Yeah, no, I will leave the opportunity to others because it's not fair for me to ask two questions.
Okay. I'm sorry, I forgot the second leg.
Oh, but I think you answered the second one because it was about what is being done, and you talked about the court case. So next we have Yogi. Do you want to ask your question?
Yes, thank you. Thank you, Ajahn Mike, and thank you, Dr. Ashwanee. My question is, I read your recent article in the conversation about how African control to manage fake news during the pandemic. And my question is how to draw the line between freedom of expression and hate speech and provocation to commit crimes. Because right now, as we see during this pandemics, extreme right wings use far-right group claim that they are exercise their rights to freedom of expression, while the content of what they are saying has an hatred dimension, for example, like anti-Semitism. Thank you.
So what I did not explore in that article, because it was very short, was the difference between disinformation, malinformation, and misinformation. So these are categories that we need to take into account before deciding whether something is hate speech or provocation of crimes, or whether it is limitation on the freedom of expression. So usually disinformation is, I can't remember like the real definition, but I know malinformation is what governments and other groups should not engage in. because this is purposefully giving wrong information with the view of swaying, okay? So this can amount to hate speech or provocation if you practice malinformation. But like generally, if I did not know something and I post it on my social media, for instance, this would just be misinformation because I don't do it maliciously. And it is very difficult, especially in the current pandemic situation, to make clear demarcation between fake news or between malicious or between malicious news or between misinformation. It is very difficult to draw the line. But I guess if we use the definitions of malinformation to classify what is not allowed and what it is, it can assist states and other institutions.
Okay, great. So we have Sidra next.
Thank you, Ashwanee, and thank you.
We can't hear you. You're on unmute. You're on mute, I think. You might have to speak up, Sidra.
I'm not on mute. Can you hear me now?
Just.
Yeah. Okay. I have very short questions. The one and two questions, like how the African courts are seeing the domestic violence while child early marriages you mentioned. And the second is that in terms of CEDAW, what is the role of NGOs shadow reporting? Is it in practice or they delay it? Thank you.
Okay, so the African court till now has not really had the opportunity to deal with domestic violence cases in terms of child marriage. The only case it dealt with was the Mali case, the IHRDA versus Mali case, where it ruled that the family code was not in line with Mali's obligation. But if you look at the report, there's a continental report on child marriage that was published by the African Commission. That report speaks to domestic violence for girls who are in child marriage situation. But again, there's not much focus given to domestic violence because I feel like similar to the international discourse, where domestic violence is somehow still considered as something in the private sphere, the African Commission or the African Union has not really shed a lot of light on domestic violence, and it leaves it to the state to regulate domestic violence. Like it leaves it to the state to apply due diligence in domestic violence cases. But again, you have like for instance, at the the Maputo Protocol defines defines violence against women, and it includes domestic violence. So if in the future institutions want to take up this matter with the African Commission or the African Children's Committee, they can definitely do on the basis of the African Children's Charter and the Maputo Protocol. But this has not been done till now. Like there has not been focus on domestic violence. Now, in terms of shadow reporting, so at the CEDAW level, I know like a lot of NGOs do produce shadow reports when they, when African states submit their state report. But at the African Commission level, this has been more, so more and more there's focus on women's rights reporting. Like I stated before, very few states report on the status of the implementation of women's rights, but the African Commission developed guidelines on state reporting, and it includes reporting under the Protocol on the Rights of Women in Africa. And at the Center for Human Rights, we are training states in preparing the reports in line with those guidelines. And we've had countries that report we've had, I think about 15 countries now have produced the report according to the guidelines and state actually what they are doing in terms of women's rights. And recently, in the last session of the African Commission, Mauritius was considered. And even if the report that Mauritius submitted did not have a lot of information on how women's rights are being implemented, there is an NGO who submitted a shadow report on women's rights in Mauritius. And the shadow reporting in the African continent works such that the shadow report is submitted to the African Commission, and the African Commission asks questions from the shadow reports to the states for them to answer to. Yeah. And this was also done in South Africa a few years ago, where there was a comprehensive report on women's rights submitted a comprehensive shadow report on women's rights submitted to the African Commission.
Great. So let's next go to Maris. You've got a question?
Hello.
Yep. Hi.
Yes. From Thailand. So regarding the food security problems across the globe, I would like to know how the African country trying to tackle with this problem, as Africa is one of the countries that suffer most from the right to nutrition, the right to food, from the climate change, or like the overpopulation in these regions. Yeah.
So we have, like, similar to the sustainable development goals at the UN level, we have the African Union Agenda 2063. And one of the objectives is to ensure food security for everyone on the continent. So if you look at the human rights institutions, I'm trying to think of a case on food security. There has not been any, to my knowledge, till now. Like, I'm trying to think now on my leg, but I can't think of any at the moment. But still, like, the African Union, through different funds, has been assisting states in implementing food security programs. And we also have the European Union as one of the major donors of the African Union, which assists the African Union in these, which accompanies the African Union in these programs. But there's not, like, human rights wise, there's not much that has been done by the different human rights bodies.
Okay, we'll get another question now from Sarah. Is that right? Yes. Sarah, do you want to go next? Ice?
Yes.
Yeah.
Can you hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you. Yeah.
Yeah, you can call me Ice. I'm from Thailand. I have question regarding like the child marriage. If they already get married, is there a channel or like certain organization that like supervise on them, or like if they are being treated inappropriately, is there a way for them to report someone? And also, like, after they get married, what kind of education, or what does it look like if they want to get like further education?
So the general comment that was adopted on child marriage, it was adopted by the African Commission and the African Children's Committee. And it provides for the protection of both girls who are prone to get married and girls who are already in child marriage situation. So in that instance, for girls who are already in child marriage situation, it provides for their right to education, right to health. And even though there's very rarely community-based organizations that assist these girls, they can actually, like those who are in child marriage situation, can report and if they want to get out of the child marriage situation. I know Equality Now and the Solidarity of African Network for Women have been trying to go into communities and educate children on what they can do if they no longer want to be in that situation. And for instance, the Maputo Protocol provides for the right to education for everyone, obviously. So even if you're married, you should still have your right to education, but that doesn't really happen. And it also provides for the reintegration of those who have given birth. So like, let's say, for instance, a child is married and then she has a child, the African Commission, the Maputo Protocol provides that this child should be reintegrated, and there should be, like, for instance, evening schools to accommodate the needs of this child. I hope that answers your question.
Okay, so this will be the last question. So another one from Renata.
Hi, Ashwanee, again, me. Yep. My question is, can be the human rights violation conducted by the private sector be sued by these charters or treaties in the African Union?
So there's a working group on business and human rights that the African Commission has created. Until now, there have been cases against the government when there have been violations by, let's say, corporations. For instance, there's the Sarah case against Nigeria at the African Commission level, but that was against Nigeria. It was not really against the Shell company. But then the working group on business and human rights has come up with guidelines on how private actors can be sued in case they resort to human rights violations.
Okay. Okay. Does that answer your question, Renata?
Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah. Okay.
It's just not very familiar with the guidelines, but there have been guidelines adopted by the working group. If you look, you can look.
Oh.
I'm not very familiar with it.
Okay. So it's still in guideline, right?
Yes.
It's still a guideline. Okay.
Yeah. Okay, I think we're just about coming out of time. I know there is another question about child marriages, and it seems like this group, you've got quite an interest in child marriage. And because we know it is a problem, particularly in this region, Malaysia and Indonesia still has a problem with child marriage, as of course it's big in Pakistan, Nepal, India, Bangladesh as well. But I think we've kind of covered the child marriage, unless Ashwani has anything you want to reply specifically.
Just to Am's question. So there's a special rapporteur on child marriage in Africa. And we have a special rapporteur on the rights of women in Africa. So what we used to do, where I was working, was that we would have child marriage dialogues with countries. So it will be country specific. And there you'll have all sorts of stakeholders. So you'll have government, NHRIs, religious and traditional leaders, and children who have been in the situation of marriage before. So you'll bring them all to a round table and you'll try and talk about the situation and why they should criminalize it. We did that for the DRC, South Africa, Mozambique, a couple of countries in Western Africa. So I think and you mentioned, like, what if CSO and NGOs are seen as a threat to those communities? So what we do is that we don't go into those communities. We will train traditional and religious leaders or community leaders in those communities to go and talk about these issues, because it's easier for them to accept someone from their community saying this rather than me, who comes from somewhere very far from where they live, who doesn't know about the social realities. So this is something that also needs to be taken into account, that change will come from within the community, not from people from outside. Yeah, that's about it. If you have any other question.
Oh, how we go. So we just got one more on FGM.
So that's the thing with FGM. You know how in certain places they are now, like the UN talked about having it being formalized through a medical doctor and not do it in communities. The Maputo Protocol prohibits FGM in any form. Even if it's by a medical doctor or even if it's in a hospital, you should not have FGM. So I think that was also because of it being a discriminatory practice. So there's no, like, the Maputo Protocol says no FGM, even if it's by a medical doctor.
Great, and with that, we'll finish it there. So thanks, Ashwani. We really appreciate this. It's been really interesting. And you know, we're all trapped in our homes, but I hopefully we got a little bit of you got a bit of an idea about human rights in Africa and some of the similarities and dissimilarities in the region. I think there was some really interesting points there that were made. So thanks for that, everyone. And we'll all say goodbye to Ashwani.
Thank you. Have a good day.
Thank you, Ashwani. Thank you, Mike. Bye.
Thank you.
Okay.